السلام عليكم شباب، تمنياتي للجميع بالصحة والسلامة والأمان. Our lecture today is Guide in Neurological Examination. How to examine the patient neurologically. The following scheme of examination should be applied. So we have a scheme in examination of the patient neurologically should be applied. We have steps starting with general neurological examination, then cranial nerve examination. It's very important for you. Then motor system examination, sensory system examination, and cerebellar system examination. So starting with the examination of the patient, general neurological examination, by examining the consciousness of the patient, starting by examination of the consciousness of the patient, whether he is fully conscious or he is drowsy or stuporous or he is comatose patient. So you have to decide the level of consciousness of the patient. Number two, examination of the mental state of the patient, and examination for mental state need to examine the orientation of the patient, whether he is oriented or not, oriented for the time, for the place, for the person. You know the time, you know whether he's in the hospital or he's in the home, and you know the person around him. Disorientation to time typically occurs before disorientation to place or person. This is generally. Disorientation to self is typically a sign of psychiatric disease. Then after we examine the orientation regarding the mental state, we have to examine the memory of the patient, examining for immediate memory, recent memory, then remote memory. Then number three, we have to examine the higher intellectual function, which include the thinking, general knowledge, judgment, insight, reasoning, and abstraction. Judgment هو يعني الحكم، insight البصيرة، reasoning المنطق، والتجريد abstraction تجريد. Proverb similarity and dissimilarity يعني الأمثال تشابه الاختلاف. Then you have to examine the attention and concentration by doing digit span or نسوي له test 100-7. This is for examination of concentration and attention. So starting with the mental state examination, you have to examine for the orientation, memory, higher intellectual function, and attention. Number C, A, B, C in examination of the patient generally or examination of the speech. It's very important to examine the speech. This is part of general neurological examination. Before you start examining the speech, you have to know whether the patient is right-handed or left-handed, because as we know, we have what we call the dominant hemisphere. The dominant hemisphere is hemisphere who contain the speech center, the Broca area or Wernicke area. In most of the right-handed people, the dominant hemisphere is on the left side, and in some of the left-handed people, the dominant hemisphere also on the left side. فلذلك من عندنا stroke or CVA مثلا right-sided CVA is more serious than left-sided CVA, because right-sided CVA معناتها the speech center is affected، لذلك راح يصير عندهم dysphasia and other difficulty in speech. So to start examining the speech, you have to know the handedness of the patient and to decide whether the patient is mute. خاف هو mute البيشنت ما عنده speech disorders. mute يعني جاي للدنيا وما يسمع، من ما يجيس ما يسمع راح ما يسمع وما يحكي، فيسموه deaf and mute. Or has difficulty of phonation مثلا، أو عنده articulation, difficulty in articulation or disorder in language. So this is very important before examination of the speech. Number three, you have to, if the patient is dysarthria, أيضا to know the type of dysarthria, whether he has nasal quality, he has a pseudobulbar, he has a scanning speech, he has a staccato speech. scanning هذا اللي يجر خاصة بالcerebellar lesion، راح نشوف دول البيشنتس عندهم scanning speech يطولها للجملة تبيها فواصل. Then number four، نبدي نفحص examination with the speech, and if the patient has dysphasia, the following sequence of examination should be applied. We have to start with examination of the comprehension, then examining for fluency of the patient, then examining for the naming of subject or objects. يعني مثلا مجموعة أشياء ويسوي لها naming، مثلا تعطي فد خاشوقة، مثلا قلم، مثلا ورقة، مثلا شخاطة، شوف يعرف أسمائهن. فإذا كان عنده difficulty in naming of objects معناته عنده nominal dysphasia مثلا، you have to examine for readings يقدر يقرأ، you have to examine for writing يقدر يكتب، and you have to examine the repetition of spoken speech اللي هو dictation، يعني تعطيه جمل هو يردد وراك. These are the steps in the examination of the speech. It is part of general neurological examination. So number 1 is consciousness, mental state, speech, and finally examination for signs of meningeal irritation. So if the patient have meningeal irritation, for example he has meningitis or he has a subarachnoid hemorrhage, he may have a neck stiffness. This is stiff neck. You have to examine and looking for a stiff neck. It's very difficult and causing pain when you're moving the head. أو تقول للمريض جيب your chin on the anterior part of the chest، معناته عنده neck stiffness. نفحص أيضا for Kernig sign and Brodinski sign. Kernig sign and Brodinski sign. How we examine for Kernig sign? Kernig sign examination doing by lying the patient flat on the bed, then knee is flexed in 90 degree, the hip is flexed to 90 degree as well, then extension of the knee is painful or limited in extension. فمن تحاول نسوي له extension نشوف elicit pain or limitation of extension. spasm يصير عندنا spasm معناته Kernig sign is positive and هذا meningeal irritation. أو برودنسكي sign كما اللي بالأطفال نسوي passive flexion of the neck فراح يصير عندنا sudden hip and knee flexion فنقول برودنسكي sign positive. Now cranial nerve examination.